Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Caroline. I'll be hosting today, and we'll just wait a few more minutes as we watch some folks log in. But I'm really excited you're here, and we're excited to talk about rural journalism. So, if you want to turn your video on, feel free to do that. If you'd prefer to leave it off, that's totally fine. I will say that we are recording this session. So if you have preferences regarding that, do as you like. I see a couple familiar faces here. Hi, Kim. I see some salutations in the chat as well. You should all feel free to, add your comments there if you'd like to say hi. I'll try to monitor it as I'm able, but maybe my colleague Tyler is also on this call, and she can help in that regard as well. So I hear that our waiting room is now empty, which means I guess we can get started. As I said, my name is Caroline. I am the digital editor here at the Daily Yonder. I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota right now. And I'm really excited to welcome two guests here. The first is Nick Fouriezos. He is a national reporter at Open Campus, and he reports on rural higher education. So if you want to say hi, Nick, I'd love that.
Howdy, y'all. Do you want me to introduce myself or just say hey?
I guess I sort of did the first part for you, huh?
You did.
Sorry. Taking over. Do you want to say where you're located?
Yeah. I'm based here in Atlanta, Atlanta.
Great. Okay. And my other co-conspirator here is Alan Richard. He's the news manager for Southern Regional Education Board. So say hi, Alan, and where you're at.
Hi, everyone. I'm also in Atlanta. So we're half of our rural discussants, I guess, are in a big city and happen to be in the same one today. So anyway.
That's all right. That's all right. Sometimes that happens. And I fully believe that even if you are residing in a big city, you can be interested in and keyed into rural, right?
The reason I stuttered is because I recently kind of was based in McDonough for a while and then moved into Atlanta. So which McDonough is basically just a big suburb anyway, but where it's a suburb too, but it's a little more rural than Atlanta at least.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. I grew up in rural Wisconsin, so that's my sort of rural cred calling card here. Great. Well, again, I want to welcome, all of you here and point out that we at one point sent out an email polling on the topics that you all were interested in hearing about, and rural education won by a high margin. And I'll be the first to back that in saying it's a complex and really important and interesting beat in the rural sphere. So that's why I had Nick and Alan here to help me. I thought I would ask both of you, and I guess, whoever wants to go first is fine, but just a little bit like how you got into this beat, the rural education sphere. What interested you, or was it just sort of a happy accident? How did that happen?
Alan, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I came by this work honestly. I am from a rural area like Caroline. Originally, I'm from a tiny town called Piedmont, South Carolina. It's a little textile mill village that looks kind of like it was a New England manufacturing, a little village built around a New England manufacturing plant in the late 1700s, early 1800s, but it was built around 1900, and it's near Greenville, South Carolina, and it's on the Saluda River. And so there was a textile factory mill there that employed thousands for much of the 20th century. And but I grew up actually outside in the country outside that village. And when so I went to college for journalism and English, and I began work, and I worked for small town weekly newspapers while I was in school, and then began to work for daily newspapers at first in South Carolina. And I knew that my rural school had not prepared me terribly well for college or for my job, or kind of just illuminating my future and giving me the knowledge that I probably needed. However, then I began to visit parts of, rural South Carolina, very, very high poverty communities, less privileged communities, if you will, monetarily. And I began to realize that I had it pretty good by comparison. And what I began to realize is that many rural students in our country face nothing short of an emergency in terms of some of the opportunities they have. That's certainly not the case everywhere, but in poor and extremely rural areas in the South, it tends to be that way. That's changing, thankfully, but it's a slow grind. But that's how I got into journalism, and that's also how I began to covering education and just covering small town and then suburban school board meetings and such. That's how I got into covering education. And then when I realized kind of the importance of it and the seriousness of what was happening out there, that made me want to just commit the rest of my career to that topic.
Yeah, so I took a pretty circuitous route, I guess, to get here. I think that's the way of journalism now too, which is both exciting and scary sometimes. But I graduated from the University of Georgia. I'd grown up in kind of the last suburb north of Atlanta, and the first kind of the foothills of Appalachia right there. And so in divorced parents, so I was always going up, and going in rural areas because my dad was living in various trailers in different parts of the mountains. And I graduated from the University of Georgia and was immediately kind of thrust in a role for a Silicon Valley startup magazine that I was their DC correspondent. And so I was traveling the country covering politics. I started covering politics in fall of 2015. So I did that for 6 years, and it was an interesting 6 years. And while I was doing that, I was starting to get that sense of like how other people relate to different regions throughout the country, and how diverse and how fascinating this country is. And also the lack of awareness, I guess, people have about their neighbors, and kind of the certain ideas they bring to that. After the 2016 election, I, like a lot of journalists, felt like us in the national media in various ways, failed in our job. And so I pitched to my magazine this idea: hey, let's go to the places outside of DC where people are impacted by policy. Let's report there first, and then write about the DC, write about the national angle, write about how federal policy plays a role, rather than what I saw a lot of my correspondent colleagues do, which was essentially, you write about the backstabbing and all the little things, like the nitty gritty of policy, which is great, it's important. But then they said, oh, I think it affects Oregon this way. I think it affects West Virginia this way. I think it affects Iowa this way. It's kind of this lack of going to the places impacted by policy first. And so I proposed that idea, and somehow they were crazy enough to accept it. I spent a year on the road in 2017. I traveled across, more than 137 cities. Those are just the ones I was able to name later, but just looking at the map, went to every state, spent a week in each one. And that experience really set the ground. That was in 2017, but I really set the groundwork for my understanding of what America was like in all these rural communities. And a lot of times my best stories were coming out of those rural areas where it was these national trends, but defying the expectations, defying kind of these like old narratives and tired narratives, frankly, about rural life, some of which has some semblance of truth, but it's always more complicated. I took that experience, and while I didn't leave that job as national correspondent until 2021, I was always integrating into my work. And then, I left that job last year, spent about 5 months as purely freelance. And then I went ahead and joined this national nonprofit newsroom called Open Campus. And they had this really great opportunity to cover rural higher education and to kind of really establish this beat, which, at least on a national level, wasn't being done to our knowledge. And so, the way I got into covering education specifically was through that role. But as I talked to the editors, and it just became very clear, like this was very similar to kind of the stuff that I'd always been passionate about, which is kind of those complicating narratives, and especially that heart for kind of communities that oftentimes are misunderstood and often looked over.
Yeah, both of those stories are really familiar to me, and I can take parts of them myself and apply them to my own sort of trajectory here. And as Nick was gesturing at, the next thing I sort of wanted to address with both of you is these beats in particular, right? And I'll give a little anecdote in saying that I searched high and low for someone to talk about rural K-12, and on more than just a one community, one school board, school system kind of way. And not that there aren't people out there doing, awesome work in the local sphere. That's, totally the case. But I just thought, is anyone looking sort of with a little bit of a wider lens? And I know that Alan, at one time at Education Week, you were doing some of that. And, Nick ultimately referred me to Alan when I said, hey, Nick, it might just be the two of us. And so I'm curious, from both of you, and the similar thing happens with Nick's beat, right? That he's the only national reporter that I can think of covering rural higher ed.
I should say covering full time, to be clear. There's a lot of great education spot coverage of it, for sure.
Right. Totally. Yeah. And again, we don't want to negate the great work of, folks doing this stuff in their own communities, but it is notable, right? That this is an area that we sort of struggle to see folks covering consistently. And so I'm wondering if, Alan, maybe you could speak to your work previously at Ed Week, and then we can talk about the higher ed too. Whoop, you're muted.
Oldest mistake in the book on Zoom.
I know.
So I left South Carolina when I was in my late 20s and moved to Washington, D.C., and which was just a complete culture shock for me. But I went to work for Education Week, which, for those of you who don't know, is kind of the national K through 12 education newspaper. And I did different beats there, but the longest, for several years, I covered kind of the South and also rural issues across the country. And I was the only reporter that spent a lot of their time focusing on rural. Some of you can relate to this who have gone away from rural communities or come back at some point in your lives, that in my hometown, I was kind of, local boy made good and gone off to the big city to get a fancy job and that kind of thing, and have a cool new apartment like Nick has there across town in Atlanta. But then in the city, I was kind of Andy Griffith, I was sort of corn pone, and Alan likes to go to those places. He can do that rural story. Let's make him the rural correspondent. And I had a colleague, actually, to their credit, Education Week had actually covered rural, at least as a partial beat before, and a woman named Bess Keller, who was a mentor to me, started it. But she didn't quite have, well, she just didn't have the context that I did from growing up in a rural area. So I went to something like 35 states as a young journalist, covering a lot, largely rural issues. And it was such an education for me. And I lament the fact that there's not a rural reporter at Education Week like there used to be. Those were some good days for journalism in terms of subscriptions and ads, even though Ed Week is a nonprofit organization. They just had more revenue to work with, more resources. That was true of a lot of media outlets across the country 20 years ago or so. Now, not so much. And so you can barely, if you have a newspaper in a town or a city, they're certainly not covering all the beats, probably like it should be, and much less other parts of a state or rural or edge suburban areas and that kind of thing. And unfortunately, although Open Campus, where Nick works, is an exception to this. Yeah, and here's somebody in the chat says that we used to have a news plane. I want to hear about that. Now we're a weekly. But foundations that would fund nonprofit journalism and that sort of thing, and even corporate interests who don't see the value in it and are hesitant about lack of impact. But some of that is a myth. And I wanted to just give you one data point before I turn it back over to somebody else to illustrate that. I'm on the board of an organization called the Rural School and Community Trust, and I have been for a long time. They're kind of in transition and have become a very small operation now, but every few years they put out a kind of a 50-state report card on rural education in the US called Why Rural Matters. I've put a link to it over in the chat. You might have to scroll up for it now. And it last came out almost 3 years ago, but there's going to be a new one next year in cooperation with the National Rural Education Association and also perhaps some other entities, including the Rural Schools Collaborative, who I think is on this call. But one data point from the last Why Rural Matters report is very, very telling. And and about the importance of rural schools and rural communities in our country. If the census designates between rural school districts and rural schools, so you can have a rural school that's not in a primarily rural school district. Like in Georgia, most of our school districts are county-wide, they're very large. But you might have some rural schools, even in the Atlanta area districts, based on population density and that sort of thing. So if you look at the rural schools in this country as using census classifications, there were at least 3 or 4 years ago, there were more than 9.3 million students attending rural schools in the United States. And that is more students, not only than in New York City, which in itself has 1 million students and just alone. And it's if you add New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, the Las Vegas area, and you keep adding on school systems. I wanted to see, hey, are there more rural kids than say than in the top 3 or 4 or 5 school districts in this country? Actually, there are more rural students in this country than attend the nation's 85 largest school districts combined. So don't tell me about scale. I know rural communities are distinctive, certainly, and it's a big country, but I'll put that link back in there, Cheryl. But when people say there's no scale to rural, how can we tell if something works? Why is it worth the investment? It's worth the investment because a lot of people call rural America home.
It's a really good point, Alan. Yeah, I love that stat. Con, do you want me to answer that?
No, I mean, I was just going to jump in and say, dang, and I haven't run the numbers the way Alan has, but this is the thing that we often
dang
are
is a good response. Dang.
So
well,
yeah, and I think that speaks to this undercounting of what rural means, right? So part of the context of me coming into this being part of, the ramifications of us not having a ton of scholarship and also a lot of journalism in this beat is the fact that we don't know what rural is, right? And I focused on my newsletter on that quite a bit. I run a bi-monthly newsletter called Mile Markers. And, when I came in, my understanding was like, I knew that rural oftentimes didn't get the resources it needed, but I thought there was a lot of tension on it, at least. I covered politics. Politicians were always talking about the new programs they were doing, how much we need to do stuff in rural areas. And then I got on the beat and I was like, oh, so the Higher Education Act of 1965 has clause Q in it, in which it says that rural communities, rural schools should be funded more. And that, that's one of the communities that act is supposed to address. And then you find out it never defines in the act what a rural school is. And it kind of just punts the definition to the states and doesn't actually even put aside any funds for it. Like every other sector in that report, in that act does. And then you go even further. It's like, okay, so we in our own conversations, is it one stoplight town or is it 3 stoplight town, right? It's 3 stoplight town, the big city, right? So there's kind of all these different, and that doesn't even get into like when I'm covering higher education, where it's like, what do you call a rural college or a rural serving college? Well, Texas A&M, it's got a city around it because it's a college town, but it's 4 hours down the highway to Dallas, or I'm not caught up on exact distances, but there are all these different things. And I think what's really promising is there is some work now being done on that. And I saw one of the higher ed scholars who focus on rural, Ty, is on this call. And, him and some other great people across the country are really making rural higher ed scholarship part of education scholarship in a way that it wasn't before. So I think all that helps. But when you get back to like why we don't have coverage of it, like, because a lot of people in newsrooms, aren't from rural areas or don't have any familiarity or don't have any touch points with it, right? And I'm not someone who thinks that most people in newsrooms have ill will or like a bad bone against rural. I think it's just hard to talk about things that like you didn't personally experience. It's certainly hard to care deeply about things that you haven't really experienced or come into contact with. And it also is a problem that compounds itself, right? So when you don't have coverage of rural areas, there's misunderstandings that come in. And then when you do finally get approval from your editor to go out and cover something in a rural area, and you do your best job, but you come in with certain misconceptions or you're not used to it, you don't have practice with it, then when you leave, the only stories you wrote about was the coal miner in West Virginia. Or, you didn't write about like West Virginia's like history of subsistence farming and the back to the land movement of the 60s that created like these weirdly cool, hippie and slightly liberal places that are like in the middle of West Virginia, right? Not that like one is better than the other, but we've heard the first story before. And then, there's that kind of context that gets missed. And I think that's only been compounded. Like if we're wondering why is it happening, especially now, it's because as the news industry has contracted, right? We have less local coverage. By the way, local coverage is absolutely essential to anything any national reporter does if they're any good. And like, I got covered by Columbia Journalism Review asking about my States of the Nation project when I traveled the country. And they were like, this could have been just a giant parachute journalism project, but you made noticeable efforts to avoid the worst pitfalls of the genre, like what worked. And what really worked for me was relying on the great local journalism being done and reading the local journalism in states ahead of time to get a better understanding, and to come in with an air of humility of like, these are people who live here. I don't. Let me learn from them rather than let me take a prepackaged narrative and apply it. And I think what I can do as a national reporter is then zoom that out and spot the trends that I'm seeing all across the country. But without the local journalism there, that's the feeder for it all. So there's that. And then there's just the fact that contraction of the news industry means that we have even more coverage that's more insular, more focused on just the major media markets, right? It's hard to send a reporter out. It's expensive, and that might not be your core readership. So there are a lot of reasons why it's happening, but there's almost no denying the fact that rural education gets covered too little. And unfortunately, when it does get covered, whether because of nefarious things or not, good intentions or not, it gets covered poorly.
Yeah, can I just throw into that? I know we want to get to folks' questions too. But on the issue of just I always say there are many different faces of rural in the US. And I learned that firsthand. I'm from the Carolina upcountry and the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But there's also the South Carolina low country where demographics are very different and it's near the coast. Do you mean the Mississippi Delta? Do you mean West Texas? Do you mean California, where there are more rural students than in any state, actually? Do you mean the Heartland, the Great Plains? Do you mean the Bering Strait School District that I got to visit one time in Alaska, which is the size of Minnesota and has about 2,000 students? Or do you mean Lisbon, North Dakota? And here's a picture of Lisbon, North Dakota on my phone, a view from a tractor, I think this morning. And I believe Dr. Steve Johnson is a retired school superintendent who's with us on this call. And that was his view from his tractor this morning. But I think he hopped off for a bit and he's haying and preparing for winter there in North Dakota. But I know a lot of y'all are from different parts of the country. And I know that there's going to be questions, and we can talk about this in terms of just how rural is covered, especially from a national media perspective. It's really tricky, and I probably haven't always lived up to my ideals, despite my best, and indeed best intentions. But sometimes you have an editor with very little context or knowledge of a rural story, and so the assignment is flawed from the beginning. I know an editor in New York City who I really admire, and whose organization has been responsible for some very good coverage of rural education issues. I remember, once calling me and saying, tell me about Mississippi. What is that like there? And I thought that was just a bizarre question, and I'm like, well, you can go there in about an hour and a half by airplane, for one thing, probably. You should check it out. Several million people live there. It's a lot of things. It's Jackson, it's the coast, it's the Delta, it's the hill country, it's the suburban Memphis, Tennessee, and so it's a lot of things. It's complicated. This nation is complicated.
One last thing on that note real quickly is it's also a definitional issue, right? So you've got almost all the ways government and a lot of agencies and organizations define rural is by population. And all that means is that we're constantly in this narrative of economic malaise and kind of like, rural is in trouble, partly because the only way we define rural, basically any healthy community is going to grow in population. Right. And so the reward for success in rural areas is to no longer be called rural. That's essentially what happens. And so these narratives continue to spin.
That certainly is the case on the East Coast and the Sun Belt, Southeast, where, growth is considered a good thing just because of, improving economic prospects and stuff. But there's a lot of inherent bias.
And then you lose rurality once you do grow. I think that's the key. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. I feel like I'm a bobblehead sitting here just nodding with you guys because you're hitting on all of the stuff we talk about in our editorial meetings here at the Daily Yonder all the time, this slippery definition, the growth, like all of the people who are in rural and often get overlooked by these sheer numbers. And so we could go on and on here, and I would love to, but I also see a few questions popping up. And so, first I'll say all of you should feel free to drop more questions in the chat. We'll try to, answer the ones we're able to. And then also, if you would like to speak your question, that's an option too. You don't have to type it, but we'll start with the first two here that I see. So one is about the work that we're doing to get more coverage and exposure on rural issues. And, I'll just say right off the bat, I think the three of us being here on this call is a good sign. But it's certainly not enough, as we keep saying. You know, we're doing our work here and trying to get it out. And at the Daily Yonder, you know, our whole shtick is covering rural issues and getting them out. We have a radio show that goes weekly. You can listen to it on our website. We have many newsletters, including, you know, signups for Nick's and others. So we're getting it out that way. But I'm curious if either of you have ideas or, you know, even sort of pie in the sky wishes on this front.
Well, as an advocate in education, I work in education policy now, and for a very ardently nonpartisan organization, by the way, SREB, which serves all the southern states, and with education research and data and policy work, as well as doing a lot of professional development for educators, not just in the South, but all across the country. I think that, you know, I talk about it all the time. All you got to do is call me or email me, and I can regale you with rural stories. But there's not that many, you know, there's not that many people, unfortunately, with national media who have been in the media or that with influence that have really recent rural roots, unfortunately, more than you'd probably think they do. But so it's just, I think it's going to take all of us shaking the trees who want better opportunities for kids and who want rural places to thrive, even with all the challenges and the serious issues that go along with that, to push for those things and to push for diversity of coverage, you know, where it's not just, I remember one story I often tell is when, and one time in South Carolina, maybe when George W. Bush was running for president, I think the Republican primary was getting a lot of attention, and Time magazine did a feature from South Carolina, just kind of on the political climate there. And I remember my parents used to have a mountain cabin that was a pretty remote place, and there was the shack of a bar on the way up the mountain called Bob's Place. And it had Confederate flags out front and motorcycles. I mean, not to stereotype motorcycle people, but it didn't look like the coolest, safest place to be. And that's where Time magazine went to write about the presidential primary. I'm like, how did they find Bob's Place, for God's sake? But it was maybe the most ridiculous little corner of a very complex state to go for such a story. And while it might have been entertaining, it wasn't a serious look at real political discourse, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of parachute journalism that we see happening is really, I think, one of the biggest things we can fight against in our own work, and hopefully, you know, all of you who are here on the call involved in journalism or adjacent to it can also be a part of that, because telling these, you know, these complex and nuanced stories rather than going into Bob's bar or whatever it was is really
Bob's Place.
Bob's Place. Thank you.
Can I respond to I think Kari?
Yeah, go ahead.
Who is with the Globe? Maybe she can tell us where she is. I believe that's a she.
Yeah, I am with actually the Globe in Worthington, Minnesota.
Okay.
We cover, I think, 6 counties in rural Minnesota and 3 or so-ish in Iowa.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for being on here. And I just wanted to address your question in the chat about there was a Washington Post story on I guess they profiled a bus driver in your area at some time back. And the story got into race and school funding and all sorts of things. And people were really angry locally about the coverage. I think it's really, really tricky. And as somebody who has parachuted in, despite my rural roots, it can be really hard to get it right, and certainly to present things, you know, you may offend people just by giving a pretty objective look at what's going on.
I feel
But,
like the story was actually good, but since that was the only story that most people would ever see
right.
from our community, that was how it did the damage.
Well, I think that's totally fair. And that's part of, you know, it sort of invites people to say, you don't understand my community. I'm sure people in Uvalde, Texas feel that way right about now. But everything's relative too. So I think, you know, from a journalist perspective, you should expect people and help people of good intention to see every side of a community and to remind them of some of the things we're talking about in this conversation, the complexities and so forth. But you know, I think also you have to give a little grace. Like I know that Casey Parks' story in the New York Times Magazine, maybe 6 months or so ago from the Mississippi Delta, also angered a lot of people. And to me, it was more just a little bit about how that piece was presented, because it was really a profile of a kid and a school superintendent who were fighting for some better opportunities in their very high poverty community. But it still got rural advocates riled up, and also people didn't understand that Casey, you know, has rural roots in the rural Louisiana and Mississippi herself. And so there's just a lot to that. And I remember being at the Columbia, South Carolina newspaper and covering an education issue in a small town where dozens of kids had gotten suspended from school or expelled from school for passing booze around all day at their high school. Well, you know, I was accused of being from the big city and making that town look bad intentionally and all this kind of thing. So which was pretty ridiculous, honestly. So I don't know, it's complicated, but I think we can all do our best to represent our places and insist on others at least represent places fairly and with an open mind.
I mean, there's always a balance, I think, to that kind of, you know, it's like how much criticism is fair and how much is not. I also thought that story was very well reported, and also thought that, you know, it fed into this narrative, especially because it was the New York Times, and that already has like a fraught relationship with rural, I guess. But the story itself was reported very well and written very well. I think also that headline was what really got that whole framing, exactly like you said, Alan. I also think that like it is also difficult because I'm an investigative reporter essentially in my role. You know, I write the newsletter, which gives me a space where I can bring the community together and talk about various things. Oftentimes, a lot of stories in that are actually, this is what one community is doing that's really effective and really interesting and good. And then, like, you know, some of my investigative pieces hinge on something being wrong or incorrect or something that is flawed. And so it's hard to keep that ethos. But I think what you have to do is you have to take a step back. It's even in those stories where it seems like there's a clear villain or clear bad guy, or like a community is there's a mistake happening in that community. You know, really doing that effort of putting yourself in the shoes and kind of understand how it came to be. And then also when you pinpoint something that's wrong with, like, you know, what we call like deficits, right? Deficits in rural communities. I wrote a piece that got co-published with the Washington Post about rural broadband and one community's attempts to get it. You know, and we have all these grants out here and everyone's saying, yeah, if you're in rural areas, just get the grant. Like, you know, we're building rural broadband. And, you know, that community did not end up getting it. And that, you know, it kind of, the headline may even suggest that, like, okay, this is like, you know, the point is it's still a problem. But throughout the piece, I tried to show all the ways that the community did everything they were supposed to, right? And I think also trying to show the strengths of the community even in that. I wrote a story about the Rio Grande Valley, which, you know, about Elon Musk and SpaceX and education tied to there. And, you know, all the things that they were doing well, in addition to things that maybe were misguided, right? And I think that kind of tug of war that, you know, one side seems to be, you know, the good is being shown and then the bad is being shown. That's life, that's complexity. And I think if you do that, hopefully they will see that effort. And I think like anytime that you're just like, assume that something is just the way it is out of like a cliched understanding of a place, that's when we get in trouble as journalists. It happens to all of us, but it's a little easier to happen when we think of rural and don't have that experience. But you know, one thing, Caroline, you were going to ask about, it was just kind of like stories of success, and there are so many of them. I just talked to a small you know, college in Vermont that helped you know, relocate Afghan refugees because they didn't have most of their courses were in the summer, so they were able to make space for them. You know, one of my favorite stories, it wasn't just an education story, but you know, when I was traveling the country and I went to Guyman, Oklahoma, which is in the Panhandle, it's like 4.5 hours from Oklahoma City, like 4 hours from Amarillo, Texas, like, you know, just like it kind of caught between states. And that community there has like, you know, a Asian grocery store, a West African grocery store. It has, you know, this incredibly diverse population. The Walmart has a whole section dedicated to piñatas. Like this is like this coming together. And my favorite part is the Bueno Jiu-Jitsu. You know, it's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu place, but it has Bueno as the name. And like this community is in, you know, less than 10,000 residents. And it's, you know, it's the kind of place where you go to the diner and you have those same old, you know, mostly white men who are talking, and in other towns, they're always talking about how bad, you know, this is and everything's changing. And in this town, they're actually saying like, actually the immigrants saved us, right? Because they came in the 90s and saved our factory. Like, those are the stories that, it's not to say that these bad things don't exist, but it's that nuance, it's that complexity that I really want to grapple with in my work. And frankly, you know, there are assets too about being rural. One of them being that if you figure it out for one student, like their family members, their relatives, their cousins, everyone who knows them, like will also take us, you know, use that information and like benefit from it. That, you know, we wrote one story with a local reporter for Chalk Beat, Colorado, Jason Gonzalez, great piece about what was working. And he took the state data, he got the state data for like graduation rates at high schools across the state. And he decided that instead of, you know, he had the data, he could just like gone to the worst rural graduation rate place. I mean, that's what most of us have done in the past and would do, right? He chose to actually go to the place that had one of the best graduation rates and wrote about what was working there. And, you know, one of the assets again of rural areas is the fact that, you know, one great advisor, two great advisors can have a direct impact on the entire senior class, right? And that was one of the lessons from there. So really shifting our mindset from always kind of focusing on deficits and kind of having an asset-based reporting style. I know that feels weird as reporters, you know, it feels like we're like taking a stance or we're leaning toward a certain side, but I think it's more acknowledging that, you know, there's a reason why people live in rural areas, and many of us do, right? And, you know, not capturing that, I think is a mistake.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's so important. And I've loved seeing the things you are calling out in your newsletter, Nick, about what's working. And it's fascinating to, you know, I like that anecdote about looking at the data and going to one of the schools with the best graduation rate rather than the worst. And what happens if you tell that story? You know, you don't always have to go for the problems. So I see questions coming fast and furious here. Some of them are, you know, sort of the questions of the age here. What can and should we reasonably expect from part-time, weekly or bi-weekly journalists who are simultaneously covering every other single story in their place? I mean, you know, I've said it once and I'll say it a million times, we could use more journalists. We could use more funding, you know? But gosh, do you guys have thoughts on what we could do to support folks in this situation?
I mean, first of all, Alan is amazing in terms of getting you stats, and especially with Southern schools, obviously. But I think as you know, look, we work in a field where I think we're incredibly collaborative in many cases. And like, if you are ever struggling with a challenge, or if you are looking for kind of a national, like, hey, like, are you seeing this trend? I'm seeing it in my backyard, but is this happening elsewhere in the country, or is there data that I can tap into, things like that? I welcome anyone to reach out to me. If I don't, I'm new to the education beat, so there's a lot I'm learning, but my two editors are old school. They've been they were at the Chronicle for a long time and like have that national experience. But I also have seen a lot of the country and see these trends popping up. Like, any advice I can give you, feel free to reach out anytime. Questions big and small. I also, we have a local reporter network, and we're kind of, we're young, we're under 2 years old, but we're kind of along that ProPublica type model of partnering with local news outlets and working to do that. So if your news outlet you think would be a good place for us to do a partnership on a piece, that's also a way for us to collaborate. But really, I think, oftentimes, just asking for perspective or help or advice is the first step. And, I'm definitely happy to talk to anyone about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what Nick's saying in that, the Daily Yonder really strives to be a resource for folks who are, working on rural reporting issues, want to bounce ideas. We're here, and I'm excited to hear from you personally. I like talking with folks. Alan, did you have anything to add?
I'm typing a few things in the chat to answer some questions. The state of,
like, I do have experience. I was lucky in that I was able to, a small experience, obviously, but 3 months interning at the St. Augustine Record in Florida, which is not a rural area, but small newsroom, 5 people. I was the intern. If I didn't write 3 stories that day, we didn't have a front page, so like, I've had, I worked at a middle size and a large size. I've worked at the Baltimore Sun, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, worked in digital media. So I have some perspective on it, but I am really curious for those of y'all who are doing really great work in rural areas. What's been your experience, especially when you pitch education stories? If you're on the education beat, what's been difficult for you to get out of? What have been your challenges?
And I wanted to just throw in that in terms of the state of newsrooms, it's been really discouraging that, many newspapers and even television stations and radio stations are pretty decimated of journalists, period, much less journalists covering education. But there are some promising innovations and developments. I mean, one is kind of nonprofit newsrooms like the one Nick works for, Open Campus, which covers higher ed nationally. And they have beats like race and equity and rural. And I'm not sure what, maybe covering immigrant students and that kind of thing, some other interesting beats. And they share their stories with national publications and also local ones. And they are building a network of reporters who cover higher ed for mostly nonprofit, I think, outlets in different states. Because there are a lot of startup nonprofit or even for-profit newsrooms in communities that are rivaling daily newspapers and that kind of thing. I believe that there's a higher ed reporter that's in that network in El Paso, Texas, but there was something maybe called El Paso Matters or something, which is
I think it's, well, we just added someone who took over for the old one who had left, but yes,
right.
El Paso.
I'd like to know who that is, by the way. But but Chalkbeat is a chain of nonprofit newsrooms that cover K-12 education, well, K-12 and higher ed in different cities across the country. Nick was just mentioning the one that covers education issues statewide in Colorado. And then there are also things called they're like education labs that are sort of philanthropically or foundation funded parts of a newsroom. Like the Dallas Morning News has this now, the Birmingham, Alabama paper, the Charleston, South Carolina paper. Who else has an ed lab? The Seattle Times and some others, where foundations that believe in kind of education as an important topic to be covered locally or statewide or wherever the case may be, are actually funding positions, adding journalists to focus on those topics at for-profit or nonprofit newsrooms. So there's some cool things like that happening. I'd love to see more happening rural wise, because with technology, despite broadband being such a tremendous issue still, there's more that can be done. And also if there's some of these federal funds coming down the pike make a difference in broadband over the next few years, you may have, more relative ease of coverage and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on, if anyone has a question though, feel free to put it in the comments or interrupt us. But there was something about that, which is just that, like, I think the positive of, I graduated in 2014 when my own journalism professors were telling me, why are you going into this industry? It's a dying industry. You're never going to get a job. And like, I just like, my experience of journalism has been, yes, there's difficulties absolutely in smaller newsrooms and especially the traditional papers, but there are all these coverage specific and kind of these opportunities for outlets to rise up, and there is investment in the space now too, and who knows how long that will last, but there is interest in both rural, hopefully more than a passing like 2016 happens, so now we need to care about rural view, but actually investments, and we're seeing some of that. I write about a lot of them in my newsletter actually, so but like we're starting to see that interest and starting to see that investment, starting people to understand a little bit. So I think just the ability for publications to rise around these issues of and the interconnectedness, because Open Campus does try to co-publish every piece we do with a local partner or with a national partner we think is a good fit. And so that ability for us to work together across newsrooms to tackle some of this stuff, I think is really, really powerful and really positive too.
Totally. I see questions coming in, fast and furious in the chat again here. I'm actually going to go to this latest one about school boards and how to cover school board elections, and especially when you don't have a lot of capacity. I think that's a really interesting, topic given all sorts of things that are going on with K-12 curriculum. We've heard about book bannings, different things like that. And so I'm curious, Alan and Nick, if you have insight there.
That's a story that I honestly, like, Heidi, if there is a chance for collaboration here, that's a story I've been wanting to work on actually, is kind of the, school boards and the kind of changing, like what I really want to know, and maybe someone here can answer it, but what is the impact on a student when you have book bans, or when you have certain curriculum not allowed to be taught, or you can't attract certain teachers because of both pay and also maybe cultural reasons why teachers don't want to go to that place anymore, right? We might be seeing some of that in Florida, right, with some of their recent decisions. So like, I would love to hear, and I mean that not in a political, like one way or the other like that, but more just like in a practical, like there are lots of rural places, this isn't quite tied to that, but like there are lots of rural places where, you can't attract talent. And so because of that, you can't take certain classes, and, are you able to apply to the same colleges? Are you able to apply to the same universities? I really am grappling with, like, in California, I'm writing about this community college, and they're trying to do this nursing program, but to do one of the licensing nurses, like, they have a huge demand for nurses, but to license nurses in a certain way, in California, you have very high standards for that, right? And the teachers have to have been practicing in the last 5 years and have a master's degree. Well, in this rural area, the people who qualify, they won't have been practicing in the last 5 years. Or if they are, they're usually retiring. Or if they are practicing, they can make so much more money doing nursing in this high demand and doing the overtime hours and everything that they're not going to teach at the community college, or it's going to be a hard ask to get them. So there's this battle where if the choice is between having high standards but no people in rural areas, then like, how do we grapple with that? And a lot of states don't. They kind of just assume that if I pass a state law of qualifications, then it works for everybody. In a lot of ways, it might not work for a rural area, and that becomes a challenge. So I just think, like, as far as specifically to school boards, I think, yeah, it's difficult, and I don't cover K through 12. So, I just think, on some levels it's going to be, I actually, I'm so sorry. I don't have a direct answer to that, but Alan, maybe you do.
Well, there's a lot of interest in school boards now. Some of it's coming from national political networks, especially in kind of social conservative circles, encouraging people to run for office. But there's plenty. Heidi, you can contact me, and I'd love to know more about your NPR station and the rural newsroom that you're working on. I know Nick would too. Maybe we can set up a call. But the school board members sometimes have very limited capacity. There are states now that require training and continuing professional development for school boards to kind of understand their role, because it doesn't serve, you can maybe agree with this or maybe you don't, if somebody's yelling about a library book at the school board, but it's certainly never right to threaten people for the decisions they make and that sort of thing. And that's really been happening some across the country. And so I wonder, I think that, what am I trying to say? That first of all, you should know that some of the stuff that's going on in terms of just social debates are distractions, and they're designed to be distractions, even if you might agree with one point of view or another. We might be arguing about a library book at the school board meeting, but meanwhile we don't, half the teachers have no training as teachers. We don't pay them anything. The buildings are run down, and there's no prospect for help with that. Kids do not have the opportunity to go on and pursue 2- and 4-year college or some kind of more meaningful career training, which is required in the economy now. Those are huge issues. School resources and funding, and how that relates to state politics. Those are huge issues that deserve a lot of coverage as well. Anyway, I don't know. I
think the other thing I'm interested in, I'd love to hear from y'all, but something I've been working on more in my coverage too, is like essentially the big question that we grapple with a lot at Open Campus is not even tied to exactly education all the time. It's what is the role of a college in a community, right? And in rural areas, a lot of times they play a lot of roles. One of my most recent editions was talking about how they're being asked to play even more roles. You're talking about, mental health, they're trying to be mental health providers for these students. They're trying to, but for the local community, like they're having to be firefighters in California, right? Like, they are like supplying the firefighters and teaching them, for these massive fires in these areas. They're having to be abortion providers, like wherever you stand on that. Regardless, they have to somehow navigate that role now and decide whether or not they want to navigate that role, which is a decision in itself. And these many hats they're playing puts a lot of stress on the systems, but also allows them to be key. I mean, they're just very important players in imagining for a lot of these towns what the future holds. And in rural towns, especially where I visited, I'm writing the piece right now, but I did a newsletter on it too, about Lassen Community College in Northern California. And they used to be a mining town. They used to be a farming town. They used to be a lumber town, and the mill used to, blow the whistle at noon every day. And then they've been a prison town for the last 20 years, and that's going away too. And the college just keeps, being involved in those conversations. Okay, like what comes next? What comes next? What comes next? So anytime we can think about education in a bigger way of what that role is. And with the school boards thing, there was this great piece, I believe in ProPublica, but I might be wrong. I got to double check, about a school superintendent in actually in our neck of the woods, Alan. It was in Woodstock area, where she wasn't a superintendent.
Cherokee County, yeah.
Cherokee County. She got asked to come in as a diversity inclusion, or kind of a diversity equity officer type of role that had never been there before. And she had never even heard of critical race theory, but she got looped into that conversation by local activists and was basically blackballed, and then treated very poorly while she was there. And then,
threatened with violence and harassed on social media. And this
And
was
that's
just a lady who had been a school principal and wanted to help kids, you know.
Yeah, so stories like that, when I think about the superintendent thing, it's like I am interested in like how the national debate over things is reshaping the local community conversation too.
Yeah, totally. I was also following that story you were mentioning about the principal and critical race theory, and just the whole thing is wild. It's getting wild. So I see some folks are, dropping off. We are 2 minutes after the hour here. Alan and Nick and I have all thrown our contact information into the chat, and we all, I'll reiterate for all of us that you should feel free to reach out. We're so glad, really so glad that you joined us here today, and it's always kind of nice to end, on this note where you like wish you could have talked longer, right? I'm sorry to cut you off, but there's so much rich, stuff to be mined here, and we'll do it again. How's that?
What a pleasure to meet everybody. Thank you. And please just
Yeah.
reach out, contact us, and Caroline can also help you find us, I'm sure. And look forward to
Absolutely.
learning more about all of your work as well.
Yeah, really. Thank you, Nick and Alan, for joining me. It's been fun to chat, and I hope to see you again soon on Zoom or otherwise, maybe.
Hope it was useful to y'all. Thanks for having me.
Sounds great. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Tyler. Y'all take care now.
Yeah, you too. See you later.
Bye.
I'm gonna stay on for a second so I can make sure I
Oh,
caught
sure.
in the comments.